I'm thrilled to be here. This is an interesting time, to say the least. I think I was going through a couple titles as I was chatting with my internal team here, and the folks that I've lived in the DEI world with. And as we were considering titles, one of which was America's Current Dumpster Fire, which didn't seem fair, nor did it seem particularly productive. But that's how it feels, I think, right now, as we're trying to figure out how to best navigate diversity, equity, and inclusion and the conversation therein. So for me, I settled on this as a title: "You Can't Unsee It." Right? We're amidst quite a bit, and I'll touch on all of that here pretty shortly. But the reality is, we're seeing a lot happening in our country today. We've been in a really interesting place over the last 5, maybe 10 years, and there have been several movements that are pushing toward more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive environments for all of us as folks who live in this country and across the world to exist in. And so "You Can't Unsee It" is really how I've framed a lot of these conversations. And Cara, in the intro, mentioned that I'm a founder, so I've started a couple companies. Some have been small consulting firms, and we've built some high-growth, scalable pieces of technology that have, forced us into helping navigate policy and finance and a lot of the areas where we see inequity so often. I'm also an educator, and so I teach innovation and entrepreneurship and have hard, uncomfortable conversations, not only in that education realm with entrepreneurship, but with diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. But at the core, the crux of my work, I've found that I'm a mediator, right? It's the ability to navigate uncomfortable conversations, to make some things that are hard to hear a little more palatable. And really, as I define mediation, it's finding common ground to make a decision. Perhaps we could frame it as finding common ground to do the right thing. And over the next 17 or so minutes, that's what we'll talk about today, is getting some common ground. And as I see my role, it's mediating a conversation between those of us in power. I think by virtue of being in this conversation, there is a privilege, there is a power, and we ought to acknowledge that. And the other party perhaps at the table is those folks who don't have a voice in this venue, and often don't have a voice as we do our work in building our state governments and operationalizing policy, and ultimately getting into a realm where everybody feels comfortable and has a say or a seat at the table. So we'll spend the next couple minutes just getting a baseline for common language, which, as we were prepping for this conversation, a bit of what was shared, and I got some incredible insights from the folks that you all will hear from as panelists here in a few minutes. But I got some incredible insights, and one of the pieces was, while we talk about being Americans, which is great, we also have 50 states, and each state has its own focus on DEI, its own acronym for how we discuss DEI, and ultimately is working at its own pace. And so what I'd like to do is suggest that there is some common language for how we navigate diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I want to start here as the framework, because this is, I'd say, maybe the thing that we agree across the board with, irrespective of our state. We have these inalienable rights, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Someone somewhere said that, Thomas Jefferson perhaps drafted that in the first go round, and then the Committee of Five cleaned it up a little bit. And so the thing we see here is mostly the language after that first edit. Irrespective of who said it, this is a social contract that we believe here in our country. The life and liberty piece, I think we've wrapped our head around pretty well. There's certainly a conversation on the liberty front, given our incarceration rate here in the country, but for the most part, we've got life and liberty knocked out. That pursuit of happiness, however, is a really tricky piece of this statement and this social contract. the pursuit of happiness is this idea that we ought to be unencumbered to go figure out what we do, what we want to do well, and then have the tools to be successful in that pursuit. That pursuit of happiness piece is really the DEI core conversation that we ought to be having. And so as I share some of these definitions, it's really framing, it's framing how we live, how we stay alive, how we stay free perhaps, but it's really framing getting the tools and the understanding and the common ground to pursue happiness across our country. And that's the really important piece of this combo. So I'll start with diversity, just simply, purely as a definition, all of the ways that we are similar and different. And I think when we talk about diversity, we talk so much about the differences. He looks different than me. She is different than me by virtue of gender, sexual orientation differences. And we like to point out all of the differences when we talk about diversity. But what's really important here is we are talking not only about the differences, but the similarities, right? When I think about an organization, so some of the early stage startup companies that I've built, while we had a racial diversity, the diversity of thought, for the last company I built, we had 5 folks, all who came out of the same entrepreneurship program with the same degree. When I think about the similarities there, that says to me those first 5 hires were not a diverse group by any stretch of the imagination. One could argue because we had the white guy in the corner and me as the CEO, and we had the short guy and the tall guy, and we had all of these different pieces. We were all guys and we were all out of an entrepreneurship program. And there's an issue with that. And it's something that as I've been having these conversations, it's very much informed the way I look at the world and the way I do better work. And so I'll say, as we go into what may be an uncomfortable conversation, it shouldn't be. And we're approaching this from the lens of what can we do to be a little better, right? We're trying to move the needle forward. And a lot of that starts with acknowledging where we are and then making a commitment to shift that. So when I talk about you can't unsee it, a lot of it starts with us, and we'll drill into that a little later in this conversation. But the diversity piece, the similarities and the differences, both of which are crucial. Here's a small note on diversity from a definition standpoint, at least, is an individual can't be diverse. We tokenize the Black person or the Indian woman or the fill in the blank type of person as diverse. And the reality is, until we've got an environment that is reflective of the larger society, we are not in fact diverse. And that can't start with one person. That has to be a conscientious effort as we change the composition, the makeup, and the backgrounds of those who we are privileged to do work with. The second piece, inclusion. So we talk about diversity and inclusion a lot. Inclusion is a big piece of that, and it's a sense of purpose and belonging for all. So, you know, it's not just being welcomed into the group, it's knowing what one's role is. So defining a role and defining where they fit in an organization, in agencies, in state government. But it's also that sense of belonging, right? I can know what my job is and show up to work and feel like I do my job well, but nobody wants me there. The flip side, I can feel like I'm in this great family of an organization. We talk about our work as our families sometimes. I can feel like I'm in this inclusive family, but I'm not sure why I'm there. I'm not sure what I do. And inclusivity, or driving toward inclusion, encompasses both pieces. And especially as we consider the sphere of influence or control for chief administrative officers in state government, we've got to consider both pieces. Not only knowing what we do and that we do it well, but knowing that we actually belong in the organization in which we exist and are tasked with different jobs. And so that sense of belonging and purpose for all is an important distinction there. And lastly, equity. Equity is this idea that everyone gets all of the support they need to succeed. The equity conversation is a really critical one as we talk about DEI. I think DEI flows really well, but it really could be DIE, I suppose. Don't love how that spells out. But equity ends up at the end because it's such an important piece. And we kind of tacked it on more recently. We've just started talking about equity more holistically, and that's important. I'm glad we're here. And so here's an image that illustrates what we're thinking about and why we ought to be. It used to be equality was the core of our conversation. Everybody is equal. Everybody gets all the same resources. And, if we're in this meritocracy, the ones who are better will rise to the top and they'll be successful. That is a nice idea in theory, I suppose, but it's not the reality of our existence. And so equity in that second panel is really what we're trying to get to at this point. We are trying to get there, and quite frankly, we're not. But the idea of equity is that we have the support. So the person who's really short gets 2 boxes to stand on. The person who's somewhere in the middle of the pack gets a box to stand on. And if you're 6'4" like I am, you can see over the fence and see the ball game. Easy peasy, no problem. That is equity at its finest. The problem is that third pane, the reality of where we are is we've got some folks who are just starting in the hole. We've got that deficit. For those who have seen that, there's a YouTube or Vimeo video floating around where the teacher is talking to his class, and he's got folks who are in the front row shooting a piece of paper into the trash can, and folks in the back of the class trying to make the same shot. That's where we are today, and we're trying to find some equity there in supporting the folks who might have been in the back of the class or in the hole here, and also supporting the folks who need more than 1 box to stand on, and also acknowledging that there are folks who have done a land grab and have all of the boxes to stand on out of the gate. And so when we talk about equity, it's not only getting to a place where we're supporting those who need the tools or are getting the tools they need to succeed. It's the conversation that we are not at a place of equity, especially if we've got folks who have all of the boxes. And so this brings me to an interesting point, and I'll have Claire kill the slides if you don't mind, and we'll continue the conversation without them for a few minutes. There's an interesting piece of this conversation when we talk about meritocracies, in considering that there are folks who have way more resources out of the gate. Is that good? Is it bad? I'll leave that on the audience to decide, but the conversation itself is real. And that brings us to the second piece that I hear thrown out a lot. Diversity, equity, inclusion is not a zero-sum game, right? It's not that somebody has to lose something in order for folks to gain. Perhaps that's true. If you think about that last image you just saw with one person with 9 boxes and everybody else just trying to get from 0 to 1, I suppose, we could make sure everybody else has 9 boxes. But there's a piece of our particular conversation around DEI here in America that does feel like a zero-sum game. But I'll tell you why. It's because we operate from this place of fear so often. If X group gets new rights, perhaps just gets to baseline on the rights they should have had out of the gate, then I don't have the ability to step on, over, or around them. If that is actually the equation, if that's actually the math that some of us do in our country, and the reality is that is some of the math. If they get rights, then I am not allowed to do the thing that makes me comfortable or that I have been doing for forever. It is not a zero-sum game in that respect. We actually do have to give up some of, they're not rights, but some of the privileges, I suppose, that we are afforded in order to get folks to baseline. We may not be able to step on, around, or through folks as we make sure we're getting to an equitable place in our country. So when I bring that up, it's because we're having real conversations right now across America. We're having a couple really big ones, right? When I think about the Black Lives Matter movement, the reality is something like 28% of African-American deaths, or excuse me, 28% of police deaths are of African-American descent, versus a 13% representation across our country, right? The disparity there and the inequity in how many folks are killed by the cops, That's a real conversation. It's factual. And that is part of why we're seeing that movement happen. We had and are not even at the tail end in the midst of the Me Too movement still. And it's because 35% of women have been subjected to some sexual trauma. That's another real stat. And when we think about the inequity there, you know, in that zero-sum game, men have to stop doing things to women for women to be in an equal place. That is real, and that's the right conversation to be having. And so the third big piece, being in the midst of a global pandemic, is considering that African Americans are 2 times more likely to die from COVID than any other racial group in our country. The second closest is Hispanics. And so when we consider inequities across the board, we wonder often why we're here. And I heard it said really well recently, when a pot of water boils over, you don't blame the pot, nor do you blame the water, you blame the flame beneath it. I think what we're seeing now in our country is this overcorrection, or an appropriate correction perhaps, for some of the systemic inequity that minority groups have experienced. There is a correction, and I think it's the right one. We've got to decide if we are going to push back and fight because we feel like we're losing something by bringing those minority groups into the fold, or if we're going to acknowledge that perhaps we are in this place because of the systems, because of the culture, because of the society we've built. And if we correct appropriately alongside those asking us to do it, will we get to a better place? So I want to jump into the data. Those are, you know, I shared some stats, but it's really easy to say, well, there are different reasons that we've gotten here, and there's some nuance to that. So I'm going to jump back and share my screen again really briefly. And while I'm doing that, it puts us in a really good position to see the data and then see how, in fact, that is affecting our decisions. The reality is, when I talk about systemic inequity, a lot of it is not overt, right? We didn't get here because we didn't stay here, at least. I think we did get here because we saw people very differently years ago when we set our systems and built the foundation. But the reality is, we don't stay here because we hate people, right? The reality is bias is what informs how we operate in the world and why we get some of the systems that we see today. So overt bias is really easy. Overt bias is you're sexist or you're racist, or you can throw in any other ism, and that'd be overt. And, you know, there are a lot of 4-letter words or slightly longer ones to talk about folks with overt bias. You just decided that you see groups a certain way and you want to interact with them differently. What I see most often is that the unconscious bias is what affects us so much as we interact with folks in our everyday life. And so what you've got in front of you right now is the Beagle Project. Came out of some academics from Vanderbilt and Georgia Tech and a couple other institutions. And Beagle stands for Bound Encoding of the Aggregate Language Environment. Basically what they did is they took 10 million samples of content, media, literature that your average college freshman would have consumed by the time they got to university. And they looked for a correlation between certain groups and terminology that was connected to them. So as you see here, the average college student would have most often seen poor in conjunction with black, or violent, or cheerful, or lazy, or dangerous. We've got one positive one in there. That's great for us, I suppose. But these are some of the highest correlated terms that you see associated with the word black. On the other side, you see wealthy and progressive, conventional, etc. For white. And what that means is we're taking the folks that we educate in this country and trying to understand how they see the world, or how they've perhaps been biased towards certain groups. And the literature, the things we consume, is a really good way to get an understanding or a baseline of how folks might operate in the world. You know, I show black and white in contrast, but Beagle Project goes into a couple others. If you think about gender, women are seen as warm or caring or loving. Men are seen as dominant or assertive or aggressive. And, you know, all of those pieces very much inform how we operate in the world. This brings us to a second one. This case study, it was two identical resumes that went out to something like 140 or so folks for a lab tech position. These are identical except for the name. The name is the only thing changed on the resume. And what you see is there is inherent bias even when we look at resumes. And this, HR folks are typically the folks that we talk about as instituting DEI programs and thinking about unconscious bias. But we also see that the inequity manifests in the HR world, particularly as you look at Jennifer Smith and John Smith. When resumes are submitted, both resumes were submitted side by side, and folks looked at these resumes, and what we found is that there was a 30% disparity between the initial hiring offer for Jennifer and John. John was offered $30 something thousand, almost 31 grand, whereas Jennifer was offered 26.5, roughly 30% delta there. And what we find is not only is it the starting pay rate that perhaps perpetuates the inequity, that gender wage gap, the 62 cents on the dollar for Black women, or 57 cents on the dollar for Hispanic women, or 90 cents or 70 cents on the dollar for Asian and white women respectively. But what we see is the competence rating that the hiring managers were asked to look at was different as well. Jennifer was rated at 3.3 out of 5 competent, where John was rated 4 out of 5. Identical resumes again, and the only explanation there is that we have some biases that have been ingrained in our culture. And the last one I'd like to talk about is in healthcare, particularly again, because we're in the middle of COVID. Hispanic patients versus white patients in an ER, data was normalized for background and insurance and language. And what they looked at were patients with long bone fracture, so femur fracture, within 6 hours of being admitted to the ER, and the long bone fracture, 6 hours into the ER, and no alcohol involved in the injury. What we found is that Hispanic patients were 7.5 less likely to receive pain medication, same injury, all data normalized. So 55% of Hispanic patients didn't get pain meds for the same injury, whereas 26% of white patients didn't get pain meds. When we think about that inequity in healthcare, where doctors leverage data to make decisions about how they provide care, we see the inequity as this really stark contrast here as well. So I've kind of touched on the gender and the hiring and the healthcare. Those are really big pieces of the conversation. But it brings us to this idea, as we just about wrap up, is that we see diversity, equity, and inclusion in our agencies, in our companies, in our organizations as this thing that we have to navigate because of liability. Often we think about it from a standpoint of liability. We look at protected classes and we make sure we're not inequitable toward them and not discriminating against them because of the litigious nature of our society, perhaps. What I would suggest is that we have a better opportunity here, and it's looking at diversity as an opportunity. From a bottom line perspective, we see an excellent increase and a substantial increase in bottom line and revenue driven when we bring diverse groups into our company. We see a shift in culture where folks are happy to come into the office and know what they're supposed to do and enjoy the people around them when we shift from protecting or mitigating risk to looking for opportunity. And that's driven by our people. It's driven by the folks we leave around us. So I'll have Claire kill the slides again as we wrap up. And I'll leave you with a couple really easy thoughts. The big one is that as CAOs, as folks who work in state government, as we drive toward having these inclusive agencies, the reality is we're in the position of power to shift the narrative, to shift the conversation, and to drive towards equity, mitigate inequity, and make sure we've got inclusive cultures with a diverse organization. That's the biggest piece, is that we are in the driver's seat in a lot of respects to shift who represents our agencies across state government, how and where we put money into the hands of underrepresented groups. And that is not only an opportunity, but it's a responsibility to consider that. that's the consideration of how we hire, right? I talked a little bit about meritocracy. It's how we hire, how we bring folks in. Do we overhaul HR? Perhaps. I'd say each state has their own policies for how they hire. But what we ought to consider is, if we're looking at the kid who was in the hole and that trying to see over the fence image, if we look at the kid who was in the hole and we look at the guy who was on top of 9 or 10 boxes, if we think about meritocracy, we're asking ourselves if one person is equal to the other person and if we'd hire one over the other. That's perhaps the wrong question. We've got to consider where they came from, what they've accomplished to get into the hiring process, and what their resume perhaps doesn't say as that resume is sitting in front of us. The second big piece is mission and vision. As we craft those for our agencies, are we considering what we say in our mission and vision? And all of us often have a diversity or equity or inclusion statement in that mission or vision, but are we living up to that? Are we truly creating the culture that allows us to do great work with great people? I touched a little bit on policing. Does that fall right in the sphere of influence? Probably not. But is there an opportunity to shift or work with other state agencies to make sure we're doing the right thing because of how it affects our own people in our own organizations? And then lastly, the procurement piece, as dollars flow into minority or women-owned businesses, are we truly, in the same way we think about hiring, considering what it took for an underprivileged or a person from a community of color to shift and get to the place where they're looking at an RFP and moving forward? Those are the questions we ought to be asking. And now that we've put some data and some color and some context to how we got here, where we are, and perhaps how we move forward, what I challenge you is twofold. To internalize some of the data that we just looked at. I suggest that we see it now and we can't unsee it. And the second piece is Harvard put out a great test. It's called the implicit association test, and it helps us navigate or wrap our head around our own biases. It gives you some rapid questions to respond to. Let's look at our own biases and let's start from understanding we're in positions of power, places of privilege, and can affect or shift some policy and some operations. So we've got to start with ourselves and understand where we're coming from and how we go out and interact with the people we work with. So again, now that we see it, I suggest and I challenge you to not only see it, but know that you can't unsee it, and we've got to move forward and do better work than we already have from here. So thank you.